An honor and a pleasure to be talking to you all today. I'm both a friend of David's and an admirer of his work, and so this is really meaningful for me. I should say that my day job is working for a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation that works to defend digital human rights, but I'm not speaking on their behalf today, unless you agree with what I say, in which case I'm definitely speaking on their behalf. Uh, so one of the premises I think of EFF and the work that we do is that there was an old good internet, not a perfect internet, but a good internet, and I want to talk about what I mean by that, and then what happened, and then what I think we can do to make a new good internet. So as a kind of case study here, I just want to briefly talk about Google. Now, Google has obviously just been convicted of being an illegal monopolist here in the United States. Their conduct has been atrocious in many ways, and not just recently, but going back a long time. But if you're old enough to remember, there was a time when finding things on the internet was hard, and then it got not just easier, but kind of magically easier, right? All of a sudden, it was possible to just type things into a search box and have pretty much the thing you were looking for show up in an eye blink. And that was a very exciting moment for those of us who'd been using Alta Vista or Ask Jeeves or Waze or these other services, Yahoo Search that predated it. And Google did some really interesting technical things in order to make that happen. The most important thing they did was adopt something out of academia called citation analysis, where they reasoned, look, people on the web make links to each other's web pages. And the reason they do that is they think there is something noteworthy about a web page, right? Maybe it's important enough to call people's attention to because it's right, or maybe it's important enough to call people's attention to because it's wrong. But either way, it is significant, and that is why people make links between web pages. And so, if you want to know which web pages are most important, you can count all the links that point at them. Now, this is more or less how academic publishing works. When someone publishes a paper in a journal, one of the ways you know whether or not that paper was successful is by measuring something called its impact factor, which is basically how many times it gets cited, run through a bit of a filter that also analyzes where it gets cited. Whether it's cited in a journal that people cite a lot of things from, or a journal that is not widely cited itself, and so therefore might be considered to be a low quality citation. So something in Nature citing something else in Nature is considered pretty influential, especially if lots of papers in Nature cite something from Nature or Science or any of the other big journals. And so this is a way that academics measure, whether they're changing the world with their scholarship, whether their scholarship matters. And so that's what Google was trying to figure out, is what mattered. And it turned out that a lot of what mattered back then was what we might call the weird web. There was a lot of stuff that was quite homespun, produced by individuals and small groups who really wanted to carry on honest dialogue with one another. A lot of them were bloggers, some of them were on message boards and so on. But by and large, Google found you a lot of really authentic stuff. Spammers now noticed that if you had links pointed at a website, that Google would rank it highly, and that a lot of people were taking Google as their first and often their only port of call for finding things on the web. And it turns out that making links between web pages that are unimportant or not worthy of anyone's notice is not hard, right? The only reason no one had ever done it in this inorganic way before is because there was no reason to do it. So Google had to kind of armor itself against spammers who did inauthentic things with links. They created these link farms and linking rings and so on. But Google fought a pretty good fight. I mean, there was a long period where the spammers were losing and Google was winning. And today, Google sucks. I mean, I'm sure you've noticed this, right? That when you go to Google, despite Google having access to a lot more money than it's ever had, a lot more engineers than it's ever had, cozier relationships with world governments that give it access to all kinds of surveillance data, access to private data brokers that give it all kinds of data that it could use to sort spam from not spam. that Google's results are just terrible. And not only that, but the inauthentic, inorganic things that start about halfway down the page or even lower that the spammers have tricked Google to show arrive below a half a page of inorganic and authentic things that Google has been paid to show you, right? Just very bad ads. So what happened to Google? Well, we can talk about how Google grew over the years. Google calls itself an idea factory. The Register, a great sort of tech critical online site that's been around for a million years, they call Google the chocolate factory because of Google's self-styled kind of Willy Wonka identity. And it's true, Google's got a big R&D lab, and they've got a division called X Division where they do moonshot projects. But when you actually look at where Google's growth has come from, it hasn't come from products that Google developed on its own. In fact, as a share of its turnover, its R&D budget is really rather small, especially compared to historic high-tech companies like, say, Bell Labs. Google doesn't do a lot of R&D, and what it does doesn't produce much of note. If you look at all the products that Google has had that are successful, the in-house products are Google Search, and then there's kind of a half a product, right, which is Google Mail, Gmail, which was just a clone of Hotmail. And everything else is something that they bought from someone else, right? So their mobile stack, right, bought from someone else, Android. Their ad stack, all bought from someone else. Videos, YouTube, they had a video service, Google Videos. It sucked. No one wanted to use it. It crashed and burned. They just bought someone else's successful idea. Server management, customer service, Google Docs, Maps, Waze, you name it, right? Even the satellite views, it's all companies they bought. Google was able to tap into the capital markets and was able to exploit a long period of sort of comatose antitrust where regulators didn't care if companies bought their competitors, whether large or nascent. And so they allowed them to grow through this acquisition. And so Google, while it styles itself as a making things company, is really a buying things company. Google was also able to leverage all the money it made by buying out all its competitors and not having its margins eroded by having to fight with these competitors. It was able to leverage that into a giant war chest that it used to stop anyone from doing unto Google what Google had done unto all those search engines that were around when Google started, like Yahoo and Ask Jeeves and Alta Vista, which is to say to come up with a better idea for search, a better way to organize the web, and therefore put it out of business. And the way that it did this was by making sure that you never used a search engine that wasn't Google. Anywhere that there was a search box, whether that was on your iPhone, which is made by Google's largest mobile rival, or in a browser, including, Firefox, a Samsung Galaxy, anywhere there's a search engine, Google bought that search box. They made sure that they were the default. They spent upwards of $20 billion a year on this. It's the single largest expenditure that Google makes. Single largest check that Apple receives is the annual bribe it gets for not letting you, showing you another search engine when you turn on your iPhone. And as a result, no one funded search development in a serious way. There was Microsoft Bing, right? So one other giant tech company tried to get in on it. But for the most part, investors and technologists understood that it didn't matter how good your search engine is if no one gets to use it, and no one was going to use it. So this is the crime that Google was just convicted of. The end of antitrust coma is at hand. Antitrust is awake and it's kicking ass. And the Department of Justice did just convict Google of being a monopolist on the basis of it having engaged in this conduct. And so don't take my word for it. This was Google's way of maintaining an illegal monopoly. And one of the things about this monopoly is that when it has control of the market, right, when it looks around at all the land it has conquered, it weeps because there is no more land to conquer. Google can't grow by finding new people to use a search engine. It can't grow by finding new people who haven't thought about using Google for advertising. It can't grow by any of the things that it had been successful at doing. It had to grow by making more money out of the lines of business that it already had. And for Google, growth was really important. And I know as leftists, which I count myself as, Um, we have a kind of reflexive distaste for the idea of firms that continue to grow. We say things like the only ideology that says that continued growth is without limit is always possible is the ideology of cancer, and so on. But there's a there's a reason beyond ideology that companies like Google want to grow, right? If you're Google, your biggest expenditure after bribing Apple every year is paying all your engineers. And Google paid its engineers quite well because there was a labor shortage in tech until about 2 years ago. And so even though there's very little union density in tech, tech workers got paid extraordinarily well. Google can pay those engineers with two different forms of compensation. So it can pay them money, but money is hard for Google to get. Google only gets money when a company buys something from it. But Google has something else it can use to pay engineers, which is stock. And Google has as much stock as it needs. Google makes new Google stock by typing numbers into a spreadsheet. And engineers will happily accept this thing that Google can make by typing numbers into a spreadsheet instead of money for the bulk of their compensation, provided that the share price is going up. And the share price goes up when the market sees growth. And so for Google, this is not just, the ideology of cancer. We have to understand that there's like a rational material reason, as a leftist, I'm a materialist too. There's a rational material reason why Google is trying to grow all the time. And it's trying to grow all the time so that it can pay its workers in funny money instead of actual money that is hard to get. And so Google starts to squeeze, and it reaches this juncture that we found out about through the Google versus DOJ case, where a bunch of Google's internal memos were released. And Google, like every tech company, has a literary culture instead of an oral culture. The majority of Google's communications and planning take the form of memos, which you might call emails or direct messages or whatever, but which are understood, in the historic context as just another form of memo, like a telegram or anything else you would use to analyze the conduct of a group of people that kept notes on what they were doing. And so we got all these things that were entered into the record as a result of the case. And a guy named Ed Zitron, who's a great sort of corporate researcher who runs a good newsletter called Where's Your Ed At? Ed started combing through these documents, as did lots of other people, and Ed hit a very interesting seam about that shed a lot of light on what happened to Google and the old good Google, which was something that happened in 2019 when Google's growth from search had really slowed down. And remember, every time you search Google, they show you some ads and they make some money. And so Google's growth from search had really slowed down. People were searching Google for all the things they were interested in. The number of people who used Google had stayed pretty much constant because it was basically everyone. And the number of searches they were doing was basically constant because they were searching for everything they were interested in. And so Google couldn't grow by making more people use search, nor could it grow by making people interested in more subjects that they ended up searching on. Google had to grow by finding a way to make more money from search. And that's where this epic fight that Ed surfaced came from. And it's a fight between two Google executives. One's a guy called Ben Gomes or Gomez, I don't know, Gomes. He was formerly he was Google's search czar, but he was someone who was a veteran of the company. In 2019, he'd been with the company since 2000 for 19 years, and he had built out their server infrastructure from like literally a couple of computers under a desk at Stanford to these data centers you see all over the world. And Gomes, from the literary record we see, the palimpsest that we get from the court documents, really wanted search to be good. And he was part of a cohort of Googlers who really cared about search quality. His rival was a relatively new Google executive, a guy named Prabhakar Raghavan. Excuse me if I mispronounce his name. Raghavan had started as a McKinsey consultant, but moved from there to Yahoo, which you'll remember is the company that Google destroyed with a superior search engine. Raghavan had actually been in charge of Yahoo search in a period when it declined in market share from about 90% to 0% and then shut down. And he was hired by Google to figure out how to make more money out of search. And in the paper record, what you see is Raghavan and Gomes arguing, and Raghavan has hit on this great strategy for how to make more money from search. He says, look, if search was less reliable, right? If when you searched, you didn't find what you were looking for on the first query and had to refine your query a couple of times, well, then say we made everyone search twice for the stuff that they were looking for once before. That doubles our search traffic, right? Doubles our search traffic. And that will double our revenue from advertising. So a first approximation. And so there's this epic fight within Google about what's going to happen here. Are they going to, well, to use a word that I coined, enshittify search, or are they going to make search as good as they could? And they decide that they're going to enshittify search. Dun, dun, dun. And that is why Google sucks, right? That's why Google has sucked since 2019, is they have a revenue strategy that says the harder it is to find things with Google, the more advertising money they make because the more you have to search. Now, Google obviously could have done this at any time. Even when they were growing by signing up new users or by finding new things to index so that people who had questions would ask them of Google, they could have also made Google search worse, right? So in addition to growing by, adding 1 million users a day, they also made each user of the service search twice for things that they could deliver with one query. They still could have doubled the revenue. So it's not like Google wasn't interested in money before 2019. The question is, why did they do it in 2019? And I think that the answer to that is the key to understanding what happened to the old good web and what we need to do to make a new good web. And so I mentioned this term enshittification that I coined. I've had lots of other words for how the internet got worse. None of them were as successful as enshittification. People just love cussing. And so I'll use that word here. And I describe enshittification as a process that can be observed from the outside and from the inside. So from the outside, you have firms that start off as being good to their end users. These firms on the internet, they're mostly platforms. A platform is a service that has end users and business customers. So Uber has like drivers and riders, and Amazon has, publishers and readers, say, or people who make things and people who buy things. Spotify has musicians and listeners and so on. So a platform is a two-sided market, business customers on one side and users on the other. And the platform starts off by being quite good to its end users. So here we are. Google gives you a search that is so good, you're like, this is sorcery. And then it finds a way to lock those users in. So here we have Google, buying all of its competitors, making sure that there's no search boxes anywhere on the internet. So even if you do get sick of Google, there's nowhere else to go. And as it makes things, as it locks those users in, it starts to make things better for business customers. So the amount of advertising on Google grows, the amount of surveillance Google does grows, the degree to which Google locks you into its platform. So if you're using Gmail, it's very hard to get away from using the other services that integrate with Gmail. To link a document in a Google Calendar event, you have to use Google Drive, and so on and so on. Google makes things worse for their end users. They make things better for business customers, publishers, and advertisers, like how Google is going. But then it locks in those business customers and makes things worse for everyone. And so, today, if you're a publisher that publishes high quality material, Google won't find it. Google will only put that at the top of the search if you pay them to, right? You have to turn your website that would historically have been at the top of a Google search result because it was the right website to answer someone's question. You have to turn it into an ad. You have to pay Google to answer someone else's question correctly. And then the service turns into a pile of shit. That's enshittification in 3 stages: good to users, then good to then good to business customers, and then good to themselves. And we see that pattern all over the place. And to understand why that pattern is going on, you need to look inside the company. What is it that stops companies from enshittifying? And what was it that allowed companies to start enshittifying? So companies are historically, tech companies anyways, are historically disciplined by 4 forces that stop them from enshittifying. The first is competition, right? When there were a lot of search engines, Google had to be the best search engine. I actually saw Sergey Brin, one of the founders of Google, speaking at a conference around 2000 or 2001, where he said, like, we are kept up at night by the fact that you can change search engines with one click, and that anyone could do to us what we did to Ask Jeeves, to Yahoo, and so on. So you have to worry about competition. When you're worried about competition, you have to be as good as possible, because otherwise someone will be better than you. You have to worry about regulation. So when you are small, especially, it's very hard for you to resist a regulator. And regulators can come and smack you around. So you have to worry that a regulator is going to say, for example, that scraping the web is not allowed, right? That was how Google created its search index, as did everyone who came before them. Or, more importantly, in the case of Google, you have to worry that someone's going to start to look at privacy law. So Google obviously transitioned at one point from being a company grounded in providing good search to a company grounded in spying on you and providing good search. And it's interesting because if you read the original paper that Brin and sorry, I've just blanked his name, Brin and Page wrote in 1998, the PageRank paper where they describe Google, they say, now the one thing you really can't do is like be an advertising and surveillance driven company if you want to be a good search engine, because you're going to get wrecked. You're going to have conflicting imperatives, and this is going to be terrible. And we see how that worked out. So lucky for Google, there hasn't been any new privacy law in the United States since 1988. And that's the last time that Congress passed a new federal privacy law. And that law, it's not a very good law. It's a law that makes it illegal for video store clerks to tell the newspapers which VHS cassettes you took home. It's called the Video Privacy Protection Act. And so, with no movement on privacy since 1988, Google can run rampant in the United States. And obviously, in the EU, you have the GDPR, which in theory would be a really great privacy law. But here again, Google doesn't have to worry about it once it got big enough, because that privacy law would be enforced in Ireland, where Google pretends it's headquartered, and Ireland is a crime haven, because every country that's a tax haven has to be a crime haven. Otherwise, the countries that are companies that use it as a tax haven will go somewhere else. So, Ireland is locked in a race to the bottom on regulatory enforcement with Cyprus and Malta and Luxembourg and to a lesser extent the Netherlands. Google also would have had to worry historically about merger scrutiny. So until the 1980s, buying other companies that in order to reduce competition was a pretty big no-no. And it wasn't until we decided to stop enforcing antitrust that was a problem. So Google, when it was small, could have been disciplined by these, but it wasn't disciplined by privacy, and it wasn't disciplined by merger scrutiny or other antitrust law. But one other thing that Google had to worry about from the early years was interoperability. That's something that is like built into every digital tool. It's just a kind of feature underlying how digital tools work, that there's really only one kind of computer we know how to make. It's something called the Turing complete von Neumann machine. It just means that every computer can run every program that we know how to write. And what that means is that if Google does something that you don't like to a product you're using, right? If they, enshittify Gmail or Android or whatever, someone can write a program that undoes that. And so, if you think about, say, ads, more than half of all internet users have installed an ad blocker in their web browser. And what that means is that whenever there is a product meeting where someone says, hey, let's make the ads in our website more obnoxious, someone's going to say, hey, if you do that, you're going to drive our users to install ad blockers. And when you do that, the revenue from that user is going to drop to zero, because they're never going to uninstall that ad blocker. And so whatever plan you have for making the ads more obnoxious, whatever revenue you think you're going to get, we have to measure that against the expected losses from losing our contact with the user altogether. And so Google was also disciplined by interop. And then, as I said, Google was disciplined by its workforce, because engineers were in short supply, tech workers were in short supply. They weren't unionized. They've got terribly low union density, but they are still the princes of labor, in the sense that there's so much competition for tech workers historically that tech workers could really write their own ticket. Interestingly enough, the way that cashed out in the kind of class struggle between tech workers and their bosses is that their bosses said, look, we're like you. You're not really a worker. You're a temporarily embarrassed founder. and you have a vision, and you have a vision for a world that is better because of digitization. So, Facebook says we're going to connect the world. Google says we're going to organize the world's information and make it useful. And, that wasn't just hot air. It was something that tech workers, many of them anyways, were really excited about. It was a mission that they believed in. They thought that they could make the world better with tech. I don't think they were wrong to think that. I think there are ways that we can use technology to make our lives profoundly better. Um, David and I met on a couple of occasions face to face, but mostly our interactions were mediated through digital technology. My life is better for it. And so there are lots of ways that you can improve the world with digital technology and reasons that people believed in that mission. Um, Now, appealing to someone's sense of mission actually has a name. There's a librarian called Fobazi Ettar, and she calls it vocational awe. When you convince someone that their work matters, it makes them vulnerable to exploitation. You see this with doctors and nurses and teachers and other people who are kind of inveigled into enduring terrible working conditions in order to fulfill this sense of duty that they have. Elon Musk calls it being extremely hardcore. And so tech bosses were able to trigger this extremely hardcore mode in their workers by appealing to the sense of mission they had. And so long as they were willing to sort of spend relatively small dollars on converting the tech workplace into a kind of whimsical campus where you had like free meals and massages and daycare and dry cleaning and a gym and so on, workers would just stay at the job. Right? They'd show up at 6 in the morning, eat the free breakfast, go to work all day, eat the free dinner, maybe, do a workout in the company gym, come back and work till late, then get on the company luxury bus, log into the company Wi-Fi and work all the way home. Right. So for Google, this was a great strategy in terms of how it worked, but how it failed was different because the tech workforce in those days, well, they were fiercely protective of the things that they made, and that comes along with the bargain, right? If you've missed your mother's funeral to ship a product on time and your boss says, all right, well, we're going to goose the amount of ad revenue by 2% by making this product 20% worse, you're going to experience like a very profound sense of moral injury and say, hell no, I'm not going to do that. Right. And you can't make me because the guy across the street is going to pay me as much as you do, if not more. And if I quit, you can't find anyone else to do this job. And so workers were able to hold the line. I think that's why Google did not do all the stuff that it's done since 2019 before 2019. So what happened? Well, we didn't enforce competition law. Google was able to buy all of its competitors. Once Google and the other large tech firms had merged to monopoly, once they'd formed a cartel, they found it very easy to capture their regulators, right? It's not an accident that Ireland is a tax haven. It's not an accident that Congress hasn't passed a new privacy law. When a sector is extremely concentrated, it's really easy for them to agree on what to say and how they're going to relate to the state and to its regulatory apparatus. And we think of Google as being like, say, bitter enemies with companies like Apple or Facebook, right? These are great rivals. When you look at the actual like C-suite and the roster, it's everyone's worked everywhere. Facebook's defining COO was a Google executive named Sheryl Sandberg, right? These people are not the Montagues and the Capulets. They are, pals. And when there's only 5 companies in a sector, everyone who's a serious decision maker in that company has worked with all the other serious decision makers and all the rival companies. And they're executors to one another's estates and they're godparents to one another's children. They are bridesmaids and groomsmen at one another's weddings. They play on the same, football league or softball league. Their kids play together. And what you end up with is sometimes an explicit, but always a tacit conspiracy to converge on a single ideology as to how those companies should relate to the state. And because they've carved up the market, like, the Pope carving up the new world, they don't have to compete directly with one another. Facebook's doing social, Google's doing search, Apple's got the, stuff Apple's got, and they're not doing a search engine. And as a result, they don't have to face what Peter Thiel, who's one of the PayPal mafia, calls wasteful competition. And so as a result, they have a lot of money to spend to take that consensus about how they should be regulated and use it to capture the regulators, which is what they did. Um, One of the aspects of regulatory capture is that it allows you not just to keep regulations from being forced against you, but also to hijack the state to enforce regulations against people who want to crush you. And so everyone who wants to rival Google or any of the other big tech firms finds themselves in violation of some IP law or another. So Google scraped the whole web, scrape Google today, and they'll turn you into a radioactive crater. More than half of the internet has installed an ad blocker, but no one's ever installed an ad blocker for their apps because apps can't be modified without a reverse engineering step that involves bypassing encryption, and that's illegal under an American Copyright Act called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and in Europe under Article 6 of the European Copyright Directive 2001. And so you have um, this kind of prohibition on modifying their products and services. So if they do something that makes the product suck, interoperability can't make it unsuck. Jay Freeman from the CEDIA project, he calls this felony contempt of business model. This business of wrapping up a service in the right kind of IP so that it becomes a crime to do things with that product or service that the shareholders don't want you to do, even if Parliament or Congress has never said you're not allowed to do it. And then there was the workforce, right? The workforce has historically um, held enshittification off because of its scarcity. But scarcity is not a durable source of labor power. Labor power arises from solidarity, right? Because scarcity can go away, but solidarity is something that can be quite durable. And without unionization, the tech sector was only as strong as it was scarce. And it's not scarce anymore. In 2023, the tech sector in the United States fired 260,000 workers. In the first 2 quarters of 2024, it was 100,000 more, and it's still going on. And that is how you stop workers from telling telling their bosses, go fuck yourself, I'm not going to wreck this product, because they know that there's someone out there who will do their job if they quit. And they know that there's no one else who will give them a job if they quit. So I think, the way to understand what's happened at Google is that Google's kind of a body, and it has these forces within it, some of whom want to enshittify things and some of whom resist enshittification. And they're locked in a kind of dialectical struggle between these conflicting imperatives. And, the way that is embodied is that behind the CEO's desk at Google is a giant lever labeled enshittification. And remember that for most of Google's history, its CEOs have not been its cuddly founders who've gotten progressively less cuddly as the years gone by. It was Eric Schmidt, who's an odious creep who's been involved with the U.S. military industrial complex for years and years. And then it was an ex-McKinseyite. And every day the CEO gets up, and behind his desk, there's a giant lever labeled enshittification. The first thing he does to inaugurate his day is pulls on that enshittification lever as hard as he can. But for most of Google's history, that lever didn't move because it was gummed up by competition, by regulation, by interoperability, and by the workforce. And the erosion of those four forces, ending with the collapse of worker power in the tech sector, is why Google in 2019 had this dialectical conflict between the guy who'd been in charge of search for 19 years and the guy who thought that the way to make Google grow was to make search worse. And that guy won. There were guys like that in Google from day one, right? Look at Sheryl Sandberg. Not all of them were guys, obviously. Look at Sheryl Sandberg and what she did at Facebook, right? They just lost the argument. They lost the argument because the battle was fought on terrain that was tilted against enshittification because of these forces that held enshittification at bay. So today we are living in the consequence of the failure to discipline these firms that are made of imperfect vessels, that are complex institutions, that are anthropologically very rich. My friend Biella Coleman has done excellent work on tech workers in the free software movement as an anthropologist specializing in ethnography. And her work, I really recommend to you, Gabriella Coleman, if you like David's work and you want to see his methods applied to tech workers. And what we see now as enshittification has hit kind of rock bottom, is a resurgence of people who are interested in making a new good internet. Uh, and the new good internet is one that has all of the technological self-determination of the old good internet, an internet that where even the people who want to harm you or lock you in or exploit you just struggle as a technical matter to do that because of the way that the system is set up. But that has the ease of use that we got with Web 2.0, when all of our friends who weren't technical enough to use the internet joined the party, which was great. It was, I don't think we could have had Occupy without that Web 2.0. The bosses who built those Web 2.0 companies who morphed into the enshittifying monopolists of the internet, they want to tell you that these things are inseparable, that you cannot have an easy internet that normal people can use without also having an internet that is optimized for this kind of exploitation. And I think that this is a familiar maneuver among reactionary forces. This is just another variation of Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. If you want to have a high-tech civilization where people can come together from all around the world for something like Occupy or to read David's books or to do any of the other things that you value about the internet, to make silly videos on TikTok, which is not the problem with TikTok. The problem with TikTok is not the silly videos, right? It's the spying. Um, that if you want to do that, that you have to just accept all the bad stuff that comes with the good, that these can't be disentangled. And it's a self-serving lie. And uh, I think that we are living through a quite hopeful moment for making a new good internet. We have seen a resurgence of trust busting, of competition law enforcement all around the world. It's happening in the UK with the Competition Markets Authority and especially its Digital Markets Unit, which is the largest technical antitrust unit in the world, 70 full-time engineers working on that. The United States, the last 4 years have been unparalleled. We've seen more in 4 years than we saw in the 40 years that preceded it on antitrust enforcement, and that has included blocking very large mergers, and now we're at the verge of breaking up Google, as well as prosecuting all kinds of sleazy behavior and making new regulations. We're seeing it in the EU, obviously, where we have the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. We see it in Australia, South Korea, Japan. It's interesting, some of the smaller countries, either small in population or geographically or both, have been doing some excellent work on antitrust, in part because the tech giants do the same thing in every country they operate in. So once the EU tears apart Apple's App Store racket and finds Apple and creates a case against them and wins that case, it's a matter of public record how Apple breaks the law. And so this is how South Korea and Japan went after Apple. They just translated the cases into the local language and did a little bit of rewriting to fit it into the local legal frameworks. And they were able to go after Apple there too. So you're seeing this coordinated enforcement. In Canada, where I'm from, we're actually seeing movement on competition for the first time in a very, very long time. So Canada has a competition law, the Competition Act, and until this year, it didn't have something called the abuse of dominance standard, which is the thing that allows the competition regulator to punish a company for abusing its dominance. Right? This is like having a criminal code that doesn't have a murder charge in it. And so finally, I know it's a baby step, but we finally got an abuse of dominance standard in our competition law. So we're seeing a lot of movement on trust busting. We're also seeing re-regulation. So we see the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. In the United States, there's finally movement on privacy after, as I say, no movement since 1988. And in part, that's because the coalition around privacy is very large. People don't necessarily know that they care about privacy, but when you explain it to them, they're like, you're right, I do care about privacy. Because if you think that the problem with the world is that your grandparents were turned into a QAnon by Facebook, or that your kid was made into an anorexic by Instagram, or that TikTok brainwashed the millennials in your life into quoting Osama bin Laden, or, if you're worried that like all the Black Lives Matter protesters got rounded up with reverse warrants that were served on Google to enumerate the identities of everyone at the protest, or that it happened to the January 6th rioters, or that people of color are being denied loans and mortgages and jobs because of how they've been racially profiled by these automated sorting algorithms, decision support algorithms, or if you're worried about AI deepfake porn of yourself circulating online, well then, you are worried about privacy. You maybe don't recognize it, but that's the common thread around all of them. If we muscularly regulated privacy, most of the other stuff basically dies on the vine. And so we're getting real big coalitions around privacy. Interoperability is popping up through things like right to repair bills, and in the Digital Markets Act on mandates on tech companies that they open up gateways so that other people can leave the platform but not leave the people that matter to them. So you're going to be able to leave Facebook and go to Mastodon or Blue Sky or any other service and still stay in touch with the people that are keeping you on Facebook because you love them more than you hate Mark Zuckerberg. You won't have to choose. And then finally, we are seeing tech workers wake up and realize that they aren't temporarily embarrassed founders, that they're workers, and that the future is here. It's not evenly distributed. And if you want to see what the future of a tech company looks like, look at what it does to the workers that it doesn't have to value because of their scarcity. So if you want to know what your future looks like as an Amazon coder, look at an Amazon warehouse worker, right? Someone pissing in a bottle, someone whose body is used up at twice the rate of any of the competitors in the warehousing sector, right? Jeff Bezos doesn't treat his tech workers well because he loves them and hates warehouse workers. He treats them well because he can't replace them if they quit. And if he can, we know how they're going to treat them. The future is here. It's not evenly distributed, but it's pulled up thick around the ankles of Amazon warehouse workers and drivers. And so we are seeing historic rises in labor organizing and activism among tech workers. We're seeing Tech Solidarity, the Tech Workers Coalition, and other groups that are transnational, transfirm, and that are making big strides in unionizing tech workplaces. Now, admittedly, they're starting from somewhere very small. So it doesn't take much to double the density of tech worker union membership, but they're part of a much wider trend of labor organizing. And so they're drafting on that to a certain extent. And so, David, he says there wasn't a West, right? He says that it's revisionist history. And I think that there is a kind of revisionist history about the old good internet that says that it was perfect or that it never existed at all. The reality is that the old good internet, like the New Deal, like the welfare state after the war in Europe and in the United Kingdom, was imperfect. It was incomplete. But its problem wasn't that we tried to make something that was oriented towards human thriving. The problem was that we didn't go far enough. And there are people today who oppose the New Deal and the post-war Social Security consensus on the grounds that you should starve if you don't have a job, that you should have no protection from your boss, that nobody should have a vote except for people who own land, right? Those people aren't upset with the New Deal for the same reason you are, if the reason you're upset with the New Deal is that it didn't extend the vote to enough people, that it wasn't that it didn't recognize racial injustice, that it didn't think about gender or have these other parts of analysis, that it didn't think about indigenous issues. Those people don't want to build a New Deal that encompasses all of those groups. Those people want to take away the New Deal from the groups that it was extended to. And so I hope that you'll join me in thinking about and promoting the idea of a new good internet, to say that there is an alternative, that Margaret Thatcher, as always, was wrong, that there is an alternative, and that that alternative is worth having. Thank you.